are these people?
As I said in our intro, the last few days are probably the most important time in the Jewish faith. It started with Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, which culminated on Monday with Yom Kippur, which is their Day of Atonement. Um, so for our non-Jewish followers who may not know what the hell is Yom Kippur, I'm gonna show. Well, I'm not. Shout out to this YouTube channel, Bim Bam, who gives a very brief explanation as to what Yom Kippur is. So we will play that so you have a general understanding of Yom Kippur and how it relates to the sermon that we're going to get into later.
Yep.
So go ahead, Reef.
Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year for the Jewish people. This is the time of year when most Jews show up for services, or at least more than usual. In big cities, you sometimes even need tickets. The place gets pretty crowded. To prepare, during the days before the holiday, people make amends and ask forgiveness from their family and friends, and then the day arrives. We learn, on this day you are to afflict your soul, and Yom Kippur makes atonement for you and all Jewish people. So, how do you afflict your soul? Famously, by fasting from food and drink. There are other prohibitions too. No bathing, perfume, sex, or wearing leather. There's a lot of stuff you can't do. Fasting and praying, though, are not enough, as Yom Kippur demands that Jews also commit to changing their behavior. As it says in the Haftorah reading from the prophet Isaiah, an empty fast is not sufficient. This is the fast I desire, to share your bread with the hungry, to take care of the poor, to clothe the naked, and to not ignore our fellows. Traditionally, you spend the entire evening and next day at prayer services. There's many ways that people actually do this holiday. Some people create their own rituals, taking a contemplative walk, or fasting at home. Yom Kippur begins with a service just before sunset called Kol Nidre. You'll notice it's the one time a year where people wear a prayer shawl or talit at night, and many are dressed in white. Kol Nidre is a public apology in advance for failing to meet our own vows and admitting we're not perfect. The chanting of this stirring melody is the beginning of a marathon that ends 25 hours later. The evening, morning, and afternoon services that follow each contain special passages. Importantly, people chant confessions, called vidui, silently as well as out loud. Readers chant from Leviticus about the scapegoat ceremony that atoned for people's misdeeds, as well as the book of Jonah, about the prophet who ran away from God and eventually changed his ways. There's a memorial service called Yizkor. Yom Kippur is a time for relationship maintenance, requiring Jews to seek out reconciliation with others, with themselves, and with God. The imagery of the holiday is of gates, the gates of prayer, of soul-searching, and of forgiveness, which are closed at the final service, Ne'ilah, or locking of the gates. There's another metaphor, being written in the Book of Life on Rosh Hashanah and now being sealed in the very same book on Yom Kippur. You might hear people say, Gemar Chatima Tova, may you be sealed for a good new year. As Ne'ilah concludes, the shofar is sounded in a dramatic closing ceremony. With the final blast, the ups and downs of a really long day come to a full stop.
Quick, Gondor calls for aid.
Time to eat as Jews gather together for break the fast. Not breakfast, because it's at night. Like any good cleanse, Yom Kippur leaves you feeling wrung out like a sponge, having gone along a spiritual journey, refreshed and renewed, ready to begin again with a clean slate. Gemar Chatima Tova.
Okay. Cool.
So that's Yom Kippur in a nutshell. So basically, a very abbreviated version of Lent, I would say, and then
Very similar, right?
for Christians, very similar in terms of like you're atoning for for yourself, for the sins of yourself, and then the sins of others. Like in your family or maybe in your neighborhood, city, country, whatever.
Yeah.
So to kind of going with that, this as I said earlier, this was a sermon, but was taken as an op-ed on Truthout.
Gotcha.
And it was written by Brant Rosen, who is a rabbi at Chicago. And he's also a blogger and Palestinian activist.
Gotcha.
So he writes, on Yom Kippur, solidarity with Palestinians is a sacred act. Both words and actions matter. Lest you reject euphemisms, decree violence against Palestinians, and fight apartheid. So
Euphemisms.
the attend continues.
Yeah.
Sorry.
There you go.
Right. Today, as Jewish communities across the world gather together for Yom Kippur's collective rituals of atonement, I am thinking about how, in Jewish tradition, words are said to have a sacred power. In the first chapter of the Torah, God creates the world itself through the power of speech. In the book of Exodus, the Israelites speak as one people at Sinai, thereby entering into a covenant with God. It is said that on Yom Kippur, the high priest would enter the Holy of Holies in the Jerusalem temple and utter the otherwise unspeakable name of God, and at that moment the fate of the very world hung in the balance. When we release our words into the world, sometimes we cannot see their effects, sometimes their power remains dormant. Other times, our words represent the crossing of a line from which we cannot return. That probably sounds like some of us on Twitter.
Yep.
As a rabbi of Chicago, a synagogue that explicitly opposes Israel's ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people, I think a great deal about the impact of our words when it comes to the issue of Israel-Palestine. We have witnessed the power of words, for instance, over the course of this past year, as thousands of Israelis have been holding regular demonstrations against the current Israeli administration and its plans to gut the power of the Israeli judiciary. Week after week, protesters chanted words in the streets and carried them on signs, voicing their collective outrage over the government's threat to Israeli democracy. More recently, many in the American Jewish community, including many rabbis, have voiced their support for these protests and have even begun staging public protests of their own. On one level, it could be said that these massive rallies have had a powerful impact. They are the largest and most sustained protests in Israeli history and the most massive mobilization of the Israeli left in years. The rhetoric of the rally has also empowered Zionists in general. Many who advocate for Israel will often refer to it as the only democracy in the Middle East. I would suggest that the use of this word is powerful for all the wrong reasons. It covers up the reality that while Israel may be democracy for Jews, it is decidedly not one for Palestinians. Indeed, for many centrist and right-wing Israelis, these demonstrations are important because they serve to entrench Zionism and strengthen the Jewish state.
Little Freudian white wing. Collin spit out, but that's okay.
Yeah. What?
Little Freudian white wing. White wing. Right wing. What? Something like that. Anyway.
It is true that at many of these demonstrations, there have been some chants and signs condemning Israel's occupation. However, this is an oft invoked word that can mean different things to different people. For some, it refers only to Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. For others, it also includes annexed territories such as the East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. For still others, the entire land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea is considered to be occupied territory. Thus, when the word occupation is invoked during the demonstrations, there is little clarity on what it actually means or what is actually being demanded. There is yet another powerful word that has recently emerged in relation to Israel-Palestine, and that word is apartheid. Last year, three respected human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the Israeli group B'Tselem, all released well-researched reports concluding that Israel is an apartheid regime. Over the past year, many surprise figures have been increasingly using this word in relation to Israel, including a retired Israeli general. This past year, a letter was posted online by Israeli academics that openly criticized American Jews for paying insufficient attention to the elephant in the room, Israel's longstanding occupation. The letter pointedly stated that there cannot be democracy for Jews in Israel as long as Palestinians live under a regime of apartheid, as Israeli legal experts have described it. The so-called elephant in the room letter was widely distributed and eventually signed by Jewish leaders and figures. To date, it has over 2,700 signatures. It is very significant that liberal Jewish leaders are increasingly willing to use the A word in public. There is every indication that it is losing its stigmatized, transgressive status in the Jewish community. But even here, the meaning of the word apartheid depends on how it is used. The B'tselem Hasalam report, for instance, claims that Israeli apartheid extends from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea.
Yep.
The Israeli general, on the other hand, limited it to the West Bank alone. There are also those who would say that the term apartheid itself doesn't go far enough, that it is a technical term for international humanitarian law that has limited legal applications. Many argue that the word settler colonialism, is much more powerful because it is related to decolonization, a concrete process of action that includes the return of refugees and reparations to the Palestinian people. On Yom Kippur, Jewish people ourselves stand as a community and say the words of our collective confessions together. As our liturgy would have it, we may not be written into the book of life for the new year unless we speak these words out loud. In the face of Israeli apartheid and settler colonialism, what does it mean for us to speak the unspeakable in more ways than one? Can the liturgies of Yom Kippur embolden us not only to speak the unspeakable name of God, but also to other political truths that we scroll down, please?
Sorry.
But also to other political groups that we have been hiding from. Years ago, I used to avoid controversial and potentially incendiary words in connection with Israel, feeling that they might well alienate and push away the very people I was trying to reach. I would typically use the words I thought that were less triggering. Dispossession instead of ethnic cleansing, non-Zionist instead of anti-Zionist, occupation instead of settler colonialism.
Which is just self-censorship, pretty much.
I feel different about this now. I actually think it is important to use such words such as these. I believe it's important not to hide behind euphemisms, to name oppression explicitly. If some words make people uncomfortable, that's okay. Once a word is said, it can't be unsaid. It is now part of the discourse. While some may very well recoil from that word, they may come around to it to accept it in time. Words can indeed push the line of what is considered acceptable, but they can also represent one step too far or the crossing of a line. There is still, for instance, a hard line drawn on the word Zionism. For most Jews, it is still considered beyond the pale to refer to oneself as an anti-Zionist, to break not just with the Israeli government, not just with the 1967 occupation, but with the very concept of an exclusively Jewish nation state. In this way, it seems to me that when we say these words and cross this particular line openly, we're really making a kind of confession. It's not merely a political opinion. It's a public admission that our Jewish identity has been inextricably connected to the oppression of another people. When I was growing up, I was routinely taught that Zionism was a national liberation movement for the Jewish people. But I was never taught that in this liberation came at the expense of another people. Like many American Jews, I was raised to view the establishment of the State of Israel as the exclusive Jewish homeland, a Jewish refuge after centuries of persecution, a redemptive homecoming following the collective trauma of the Holocaust. That trauma is compounded by the sense that the world was complicit in it, that the Jewish people were abandoned by the international community. To be sure, the Allied nations should rightly bear deep shame for his inaction during the Holocaust and his refusal to accept Jewish refugees following the war. But even as our Jewish trauma is all too real, it was tragic and profoundly wrong to justify it by inflicting trauma on another people, to establish a Jewish state on the backs and create what has now become the largest refugee population in the world.
Yep.
When Jewish Zionists publicly confess and act on the truth of this history, it can often shake their Jewish identity to the core. This phenomenon often reminds me of something James Baldwin wrote in his classic 1962 essay, A Letter to My Nephew. So actually, we're going to listen to it instead of
Great.
read it. So
I
it's
love
not his
James
voice.
Baldwin.
So if you want to play the next slide, and we
Yep.
have a time to where we have wants to read it.
But as you will discover, people find it very difficult to act on what they know. To act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. In this case, the danger in the minds of most white Americans is the loss of their identity. Try to imagine how you would feel if you woke up one morning to find the sun shining and all the stars aflame. You would be frightened, because it is out of the order of nature. Any upheaval in the universe is terrifying because it so profoundly attacks one's sense of one's own
Reality. Sorry, it just cut off there.
It happens.
Though Baldwin was addressing white
Yep.
supremacy in the US, I think his words were equally applicable to Jewish supremacy in Israel. Zionism has become such a delectable part of Jewish identity that has caused us to enable, or at the very least tolerate, the oppression of another people. The power of this mythic Zionist narrative manages to keep truth on this ongoing oppression at bay, lest it causes everything we once held so dear to come crashing to the ground. Scroll down, please. I experienced this upheaval personally in 2008 at my former congregation. During Israel's military assault on Gaza, I experienced deep anguish, and I expressed those feelings in a blog post. While I had often been critical of Israel in the past, this was very different. Rather than using the usual words calling for balance and a plea for peace on both sides, I used strong and angry language, explicitly naming Israel as the oppressor. I concluded my post with these words. We good Jews are ready to protest oppression and human rights abuses anywhere in the world, but are all too willing to give Israel a pass. It's a fascinating double standard, and one I know all too well. I understand it because I've been just as responsible as anyone else for perpetuating it. So no more rationalizations. What Israel has been doing to the people of Gaza is an outrage. It has brought neither safety nor security to the people of Israel, and has wrought nothing but misery and tragedy upon the Palestinian people. There, I said it. Now what do I do? Now, many years later, I realized that post was a kind of confession. Though I didn't know it at the time, even when I wrote those words, I was actually crossing a line that would eventually force me to leave my congregation. To use Baldwin's words, it was upheaval so profound that it attacked my sense of my own reality. I was fairly sure I couldn't continue as a congregational rabbi, and I wasn't completely sure what kind of Jew I would be either. But once our words are out into the world, there are myriad ways their power might be manifested. I was eventually able to recover my Jewish identity along with my Jewish conscience. Speaking those words was unexpectedly liberating. I discovered there were other Jews like me, lots and lots of them, and together we became part of an emergent Jewish community that had the freedom to say out loud what must be said. I have no illusions that there is a distinct minority of Jews on this side of the line, but I also know that there are many who are now crossing over, breaking their silence on Israel-Palestine in unprecedented ways. the new Jewish community that I'm a part of, it creating a new counter narrative to the Zionist narrative that has been dominant for so long. One critical part of this counter narrative is the understanding that standing in solidarity with Palestinians is a mitzvah, a sacred act. Those who engage in solidarity with disenfranchised people know that while words may have great power, words can
Great
quickly
power
lose their
has
power.
great responsibility. Sorry, Uncle Ben? No? Okay.
Yeah. Words
Great
can quickly.
power comes
Let me read that
great
again.
responsibility. Anyway.
Those who engage in solidarity with disenfranchised people know that while words may have great power, words can quickly lose their power if they do not lead to action. Indeed, history is littered with the portrayal of empty words, promises unkept, and treaties broken. It can often be a challenge to those who are trying to practice solidarity in good faith. The growing popularity of land acknowledgements is significant and important, but as many Native people have pointed out, they amount to empty words unless they attain accountability, unless they exist in a larger context of decolonization and reparation. As President Robert Larson of the Lower Sioux Indian community has put it, an apology or an acknowledgement is one thing, but what are you going to do next? The same applies to those who are expressing solidarity with the Palestinian people. Yes, the words we say matter, but unless they lead to genuine transformation, they will remain little more than empty words. Words represent the initial spark, but once kindled, it takes real effort to sustain and increase its power. We must take active responsibility to maintain that initial spark. Otherwise, it will eventually sputter out. Putting our words of solidarity with Palestinians into action can take many forms, but a core priority requested by Palestinian civil society groups is support for BDS, the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. I invite any Truthout readers who are interested to attend a free online Yom Kippur conversation. Actually, it happened
A couple days ago. Yeah.
With Amar Bagoti, the co-founder of the BDS National Committee, who will be talking about repentance, reparation, and ethical reconciliation, a Palestinian vision for common liberation. And readers of all faith communities can organize their religious institutions, sign a pledge from the Apartheid-Free Communities Initiative, a newly created interfaith coalition convened by the American Friends Services Committee. In that statement, signatories pledge to join others in working to end all support to Israel's apartheid regime, settler colonialism, and military occupation. Signing a public pledge like this helps grow our courage to speak unspeakable truths and struggle to live out these words as a community. In the sacrament service, the Jewish morning prayer, we say the words Baruch She'amah V'Ahavat Alom. Sorry, I got that wrong, but not Hebrew. Blessed is the one who spoke and the world became. While this literally refers to God, it is also a statement about the potential within each and every one of us. Our words have the power to transform our lives and our world, indeed, to create whole worlds anew. So on this day, I offer this as a collective blessing to challenge us all. Let us find the courage to speak the words that must be spoken. Let our words kindle the sparks of possibility, and may they inspire us to create the world we know is possible. A world of justice, repair, and wholeness for all who dwell on earth.
Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
Did you ever watch Dune?
Doom?
Dune.
Oh,
D-U-N-E.
No.
Okay. You should watch the original. I'm gonna be a little nerdy with Dune. I mean, you should also read the book. But it's essentially space Palestine. For the most part. For lack of a better analogy here. But words literally have power in Dune. Right?
Right.
Like Muad'Dib becomes a killing word, right? And it's based off this premise that words have power in Judaism, right? and that the Palestinians then taking the word become even greater. Right? It's weird and complicated, but oh, what happened? Oh, did he? You must have froze.
Yep.
Okay. Well, let's fix that then. On Discord, what are we doing? But yeah, it's weird sci-fi analogy for this, but I mean, it took them having a violent uprising to get their power. So, but you know, they had little laser beams that if you said the right word, things blew up. So, you know, fun times. And you know, spice controls the universe and all that. I'm surprised you haven't watched this, Collin. It's good. David Lynch.
I don't watch anything.
You know, they recently had one. What does the new one have in it? Zendaya. I think Zendaya's in the new one.
Timothy
Chalamet,
I think is in the new one. Yeah.
Yeah. I heard it's not bad either, but yeah. Soul Construct in the chat. The spice was Flo, Collin. He who controls the spice. Dude, the original one, the other one people should watch is Jodorowsky's Dune, which it's a documentary on. They were going to make Dune before David Lynch made Dune, right? And they had like Giger was doing artwork for it. They were gonna have like Mick Jagger was gonna be in it. It was weird. But yeah, Dune's an interesting book when you get into it. Ton of weird lore. But yeah, it's space Palestine, so I felt like it applies. You know, we were talking about words have power.
Yeah.
But
you know, but as Brant stated, words have power, but you have to apply them to action. And I think, you know, and you can make this connection really to anything, but I think especially that we have more political discussions on this show. Mostly, you know, you can definitely make that. I mean, it goes without saying, we talk about this all the time, how, you know, many of our politicians just have empty rhetoric in terms of the things that they say that they're going to do or how they're going to change the world, you know, and then they don't necessarily back that up with the action, or at least the action that they do is very tepid, you know.
You said do.
They're not very forceful in their actions necessarily.
Right.
And, you know, but you can also see it, and I said it on Twitter, you know, like Twitter is a lot of noise, and it's true, it is a lot of noise. And I don't want to say very few, because I'm sure there are a lot of people who are taking actions in different ways. But I think an independent media is accustomed to the fact that, these people just sit behind their, you know, computer screens and basically dictate to people what they should know, what should they be doing while they sit in their ass. And, you know, I could say for me, you know, like, I do this once a week, and for all intents and purposes right now, I can only afford to do it once a week because I have a job and stuff like organizing that I do here that actually takes up more of my time than doing this. So I'm actually doing the work like within my job, and then outside of work, that causes me not to do this every waking moment. So I like to think I kind of practice what I preach in terms of in the way that I do it. I want to inspire others to kind of do it, which is
speaking of preaching. This seems very similar to me to like king stuff, where we have to take the word of the oppressor and like actually reanalyze it to suit our own needs, you know. Like in the word of the Bible, right? As you know, I mean, similar to a lot of like Black liberation stuff, we're using that kind of stuff. But it was just an interesting like recontrol that narrative, as well as all the other narratives we have to like retake,
right?
You know,
right. But the thing is, here's the thing with the Bible. Well, here's the thing with any of these ancient books.
Yes,
and like
they are open to interpretation. That's
They're open to interpretation, but within that interpretation, you have to understand, first of all, the Bible as we know it now, and I'm just using that because I grew up in the Christian faith,
yeah,
and I studied this in high school and college. Um, it was written to be read out loud, number
yeah,
one. So a lot of what we get from the Bible was actually oral, number
right,
one. It was actually, and two, they were written for certain audiences of that time. So, like, I think the letters of Paul are a good example. Like, they were often like, and for many of those letters, he wrote them in jail. So he would ship off his letters to whatever community that he was speaking to or was supposed to speak to, and kind of use their suffering or their oppression as the basis of,
yep,
their empowerment, essentially. So you have to kind of look at it in the context of the time, and then, and then the audience of whom essentially this
well,
oral
see,
tradition was spoken
that was
to.
always my
And
thing. I grew up here in the Bible Belt, right? So, that faith is definitely a big factor in local stuff, so but it was always shocking to me growing up how much they didn't know and understand in those teachings. So, we might switch to Zoom if that helps, but we can do that in a bit. But for me, I eventually became not part of that faith and religion as a whole, partially because of that.
right.
Like it gets
I missed part-
bastardized, controlled, manipulated into
Right.
something that it's not.
Right.
So
but that's not, and we've talked about this, and no, like we've watched a lot of Kwame Ture that's spoken about this.
Yes.
It's not,
Baldwin, Malcolm,
it's
I mean,
not
all of them did, right?
It's not the religion in of itself. Well,
I mean, I'm more than
not
willing to blame it.
the philosophy
You know?
of the religion that's necessarily the problem. It's the
Right.
culture of how we use it and perverse it. That's the problem. It's
Yeah.
how we twist it. That's the problem. And and I appreciate with Brant, and we heard kind of a similar thing with Miko as well, how they had to kind of realize they had this epiphany in terms of seeing potentially within their faith this segregation slash elitist view
Yeah.
of their faith in terms of what they believed was owed to them due to their oppression, that they were willing to oppress others in the
Yeah.
name of, oh, this land was promised to us.
What's that?
And
There's a classic animation of where it speaks to that. I think it's literally called This Land. Uses that Sinatra track. Kind of goes in, and it's super old too. I mean, it's like, I want to say it was like early 2000s that thing was done.
right.
But yeah, I mean, just as a side note, I'm with the chat as far as religion's concerned. Not a fan overall.
Right.
But
I mean,
I get where it, like, there's a interesting discussion between Richard Dawkins and Stephen Fry and the diocese of the Catholic Church at the time, where it's like, did the Catholic Church do more good than bad? And Stephen Fry and Hawkins knocked it out of the park. It was terrible. On top of your entire book is a lie, canonized by political leaders, so, but that was the thing I always found funny about religious people here, that the history of the religion they know nothing about, which I just find, like, are we going to talk about what is it? The schism, the great schism you know, where they're trying to figure out if the Trinity is a thing.
Right.
You know, like that's still a big factor.
Right.
Like,
And I was very fortunate because I went to a Catholic high school, so I had to learn this stuff anyway. But most people would not necessarily know that, you know.
right.
And or I would argue a lot of these pastors may not necessarily have that training
No.
or that biblical history to really understand that and really kind of make that application. Like the idea of reading any ancient texts, such as the Bible or the Torah or the Quran, I would argue,
Yeah.
is it was written for a certain audience and at a certain time. A lot of those things may not necessarily relate or connect to things that are happening now. So how can we best apply some of the practicalities of what they were doing then within a modern context now?
Yeah.
Like, but there are often churches that are literally to the literal to the idea of everything in the Bible is gospel, literally, and then having to apply it as is as what it said in the Bible.
Yeah, literal.
Without the consideration of the context, analyze it to understand the idea of who was spoken to and the practical application of what it would mean to apply it in today's world. So really, like,
no, I agree.
Like this should,
you know, it's similar to how the Jewish faith has bastardized Judaism as well as all the other ones. Same thing with, you know, the Wahhabism.
But I think that's more a unique problem within the West, given capitalism and then racism, by extension, racism.
It's much harder to bastardize things like Taoism and Shinto and things like that, you know? Like,
right. But I would argue there's more of a purer sense of Christianity, at least from what I've seen in the global South, because you don't have the distractions of capitalism to really influence your thinking or kind of perverse your thinking in terms of when you read the Bible and you're kind of interpreting it from your modern worldview, which often is related to capitalism. When you're in the global South, especially if you're the working poor, you don't have that as a crutch necessarily. So you're able to kind of look, not to say in a way that they kind of look at things is even correct, but I'll say it's a lot more closer to what is actually, in my mind, actually lived out than how we probably do here in our capitalist society. So just something.
I'm sure there's going to be a lot of conversation about this segment. So, you know, comments are down there if you want to hash it out. You know, I'm sure there's some thoughts people would have. You know, make sure to like and subscribe too while you're there. The buttons are right down there while you're scrolling past them. But you know, anyway,
but I do appreciate before we go into the next segment, I do appreciate Brant's vulnerability here in terms of kind of admitting, you know, he basically told his life story in the sermon, just being like, when I made the realization of what I was doing and how I was hurting another community in terms of uplifting his, then he realized that he needed to make a turn, which was very difficult, but he found community out of that. And I think very fortunate that he's able now to lead a temple now that promotes having solidarity with Palestinians. And even as we know, like Indy has had private conversations with us, that's not necessarily the case in many temples in this country, that they kind of promote a lot of the Zionist viewpoints. That I think really kind of stifle a lot, I think, of what it means to be Jewish, but I think in terms of kind of promoting this Zionist sentiment, that's still kind of pervasive within the faith. Well, I would argue across, I think just generally like in the Jewish faith, but you can also make that association within politics as well, translated into, I would argue, the Christian faith as well.
Right.
Given, the promise of this sacred land that also has its ties to Christianity as well. So, but yeah, I'm sure, yeah, as you said, I'm sure people will have comments on it, but
Yeah.
you have to really appreciate anyone who speaks in their truth. And Brent, I think, definitely has been true to his word, literally, in terms
Yeah.
of speaking out against the injustice and having the empowerment to kind of bring other people along to kind of form a community where they're able to speak out and do actions to support Palestinians. And so I think really that's a huge call for us in independent media, which kind of echoes what Miko said to us back a couple of months ago of what he imagines mainstream media should be doing to uplift and empower Palestinians, that they're able to do similar work that Brant is trying to do as well.